Yeah, I was here a year ago when we had this five-person panel up here on risers for that book, Women Waging War, and that was just a really fun night. It was a really good group and really nice memories from that. And then so that was like a slightly early preview of my work on the burning of New York City in 1776. I had a little essay on the woman who burned, who I think helped to burn New York City. And so I go into a lot more detail about her in that essay. And then I talked about her a little bit in my book that then came out this past January on the Great Fire of New York. So if people are interested in me and my work, I hope they'll check out that newer book too. But my even fonder memory of being here at Anderson House was, 10 years ago, right? The book had come out in 2010. And then they were only awarding the Cox Prize every 3 years, and it was right around the time my son was born. Like they were initially like, "Hey, could you come on September and we'll award you this prize?" And I was like, "What a coincidence! That's the due date for the child that's about to be born. So I don't think I'm going to be able to make it then." So they set me up, I think, at a different weekend in October, and and you can see I've got the baby with me, and both his middle and first name are line up with charter members of the Society of the Cincinnati. So I pointed out that trivia fact to the audience. But that was a really lovely evening, and it's so nice to be back and talking about the Tea Party again. So the other really fun thing that I want to say about today is I was making Andrew a little nervous. I was supposed to get here hours ago. And then I was texting him like, "Oh, I'm probably not going to show up until about half an hour before the talk starts. Don't worry, I'm in town. Like, I hope that's okay." But the reason is I got to have this great experience with Corinne over there. I was at the National Archives Museum on Pennsylvania Avenue, and they are mounting a small exhibit tomorrow on the Boston Tea Party, and they have the pension records, and there were a couple of guys who in their pension applications mentioned participation in the Boston Tea Party, even though that wasn't going to get them a pension, right? Only military service got you a pension. But nevertheless, right, these were guys who had served either in privateering expeditions or in the army. But prior to that, they said, "Hey, I grew up in Boston and I participated in throwing the tea overboard." And two or three of the exact accounts that I'm going to be talking about in my remarks today, the originals, I got to see them and take pictures of them today, or maybe not the originals, but like definitely close to the originals, or at least the National Archives copies of these pension records. So just a wonderful DC day of thinking about the Boston Tea Party. So I'm really excited to share all this with you today. So here we go. This is a document that I laid eyes on today. In 1820, a 61-year-old Ohio blacksmith who had no more than $70 worth of property to his name made a startling admission in court. "I was on board the East India Company's ships in the harbor of Boston," he said, "and I assisted in throwing the tea overboard on the 18th of December." He meant the 16th. We'll forgive the error. It had been many years ago at that point. December in the year AD 1773. "Being then," he said, "15 years of age." So here's a guy who was 15 years old in 1773. By 1820, he's 61 years old. So, and his name is Joshua Wyeth. And Joshua Wyeth had just done what no more than 4 or 5 people had ever done before up to that point. He confessed to having participated in the Boston Tea Party, right? At that time, I have no records of more than 4 or 5 people like saying in writing that this was something that they had done. So Wyeth went on to describe his military service. He participated in the Battle of Bunker Hill, the Battle of Brooklyn, the Battle of Harlem Heights, Battle of White Plains. And his goal was he was attempting to get a pension from the United States government, which had never really adequately rewarded its revolutionary soldiers for their service. The officers did okay. Rank and file soldiers, not so much. But Wyeth's testimony, right, raises all these questions for us. Why had the Boston Tea Party happened? Why did Wyeth join in? How did the Tea Party become a turning point for the coming of the American Revolution? And if it was so important, right, because we've all heard of the Boston Tea Party, we think it's important, but if it was so important, why had it stayed secret for almost 50 years? And what does all of this mean? So in publishing 13 years ago, this book on the Boston Tea Party, what I had found in my research is that the event that seems so familiar to us, seems so obvious to us, actually has a ton of surprises. And the Tea Party 13 years later is still surprising me with work that has come out in the interim that speaks to our changing interests and the ways that the Boston Tea Party continues to be relevant to us today. So 15 years after his court appearance, so now it's 1835, I keep taking us further and further away from the event, Wyeth was able to tell his story in more detail in a newspaper interview. He talked about the indignation that he and his associates felt about political issues in Boston. I do have slides. Let's keep those going. So legal tea, right? Tea from the British East India Company bore a tax or a duty that had been imposed by Parliament under the Townshend Act or the Revenue Act of 1767, 3 pence per pound. Not that much. Most people could afford it, right? Wholesalers are going to pass that cost on to retailers. You're not going to feel it too much. But obviously, we know, because we've heard of no taxation without representation, that this is making the American colonists really angry. And so to protest the Townshend Act, just as they had done after the Stamp Act, the American colonists hit upon a more serious form of protest, which they call the non-importation agreements, what we would call a boycott, right? We Americans say, we're not going to import any British manufactured goods, any tea, right? Anything that we tend to rely on the British for, these luxuries that we don't really need, until, as a way of kind of putting pressure on British merchants, because we figure the British merchants have more juice than us in Parliament. And so if we can stop trade between London and the American colonies, right, this might be the leverage that we need to get Parliament to repeal these duties that are so annoying to the American colonists. They don't want to pay them. They don't feel that they should have to pay them because they're not, of course, represented in Parliament. But the trick is, right, in order for those agreements, these non-importation agreements to work, right, they had to kind of be universal, right? Like if New York and Philadelphia aren't importing any tea, but Boston is, that's a problem, right? Because then, it gets imported to Boston, you put it on some sort of coastal ship, then it gets sold in New York and Philadelphia. Anyway, now your boycott doesn't mean anything, right? So you've got to get these colonies to coordinate with one another when that's not really something that they are used to doing in 1768, 1769, 1770. So, and that's basically what happens. By 1770, New York City and Philadelphia had gotten their legal tea imports down to about 0. If you look at customs record, it says, how much tea did we import this year? None. Now, they're still drinking tea in New York and Pennsylvania. They're just drinking tea that was smuggled from other East India companies in continental Europe, the Danish, the Dutch, whoever would, get tea from China and bring it back to Europe or bring it to St. Eustatius or whatever, get it to the American colonies. Totally illegal, but that was the way middle colonists got their tea. But in Boston, while smugglers were doing some of the importing of tea, plenty of legal tea under the British East India Company was still entering the New England market. And so then when the non-importation agreements collapsed in 1770, many of the radical patriots in the middle colonies blamed Boston for having failed to keep up its end of the non-importation agreements. And these resentments, by the way, were still lingering in 1773. So the tax on tea is actually from 1767, not 1773. So what's the Tea Act of 1773 about then? Under the Tea Act of 1773, it actually technically had nothing to do with taxing the American colonies. What the act was supposed to do was, the East India Company was having all sorts of problems. It was overextended in India. It had too much tea in its warehouses. It was going bankrupt. It needed certain kinds of help from the British government. And so Parliament's like, all right, like a lot of us are invested in the East India Company. The East India Company is too big to fail. We can't let it go bankrupt. Let's figure out something to do here. So what they do is they say, all right, East India Company, we are going to give you a tax break on any tea that you ship to America. So now you will be able to ship your tea directly to America. You won't have to go through a British merchant house or an American merchant house. So you'll make more profit this way, right? And it's going to be, and the bonus, as I'll be talking about in a second, is that was also going to make it cheaper for American colonists. In spite of the tax, Americans would actually be paying less for their tea. So let me go back to Joshua Wyeth's newspaper interview from 1835. He says, our indignation was increased by having heard of the arrival of the tea ships in November 1773. So the Tea Act is passed, and the East India Company is like, oh boy, right? Let's send tea, some shipments of tea to America. And this was what Wyeth remembered as the turning point, was the arrival of the first of 3 merchant ships in Boston Harbor. The Dartmouth was the first of the ships to arrive. The 3 ships in total had about 340 chests of tea aboard, designated for sale in Boston and then to the rest of New England. There was a 4th ship that was also supposed to go to Boston, but it ran ashore on the back of Cape Cod, and that becomes a whole other mess. And then there were 3 other ships, one apiece to New York City, to Philadelphia, and to Charleston. So there are a bunch of different venues where what to do about the tea is going to play out. So in all 4 of these seaports, right, the radicals, we could call them the Sons of Liberty, they said, we don't want this tea to land. We want it sent back to London. But it's not so simple, right? The East India Company had handpicked a few firms in each of the cities to be the consignees, right? The agents, the particular firms that were set to receive the tea. And these consignees were real human beings. They were merchants. This is how they made their money. They are not enthusiastic about punking out on these generous commissions, all the money that they're going to make from getting these wholesale shipments of tea and then, breaking it into smaller parcels and selling it all around New England. And the owners of the ships, right, these were just private, you can think of them as truckers, right? Like these merchant ships that had come to Boston, right? They, the Bostonians say, hey, could you turn your ship around with dutiable goods on board and go to London? The ship owners were like, no, if I do that, the Royal Navy, customs officials can seize my ship, and everything on it, sell it at auction, and I will, and I'll be ruined, right? So I cannot legally now head back to London with the tea still on board. So you patriots need to figure out something else. Either get me special permission, get me some kind of waiver. I don't want to be held liable here. In New York City and Philadelphia, as it turned out, the radicals were able to pressure the consignees, the ship owners, and the local officials, and they were able to send their tea shipments back to London. In Charleston, they work out a deal where it's just going to be stored in a warehouse for a while and nobody's supposed to touch it. Eventually, it's actually all sold in America, but we won't talk about that. But in Boston, that all happens a little bit. Most of that happens a little bit later. But in Boston, the consignees initially refused to resign their commissions, and the customs officers and the governor basically say, we refuse to look the other way. We are not going to let these ships go back to London with the tea still aboard. So back to Wyeth's interview. He says, we agreed that if the tea was landed, the people could not withstand the temptation and would certainly buy it. And this is something Samuel Adams says too, right? Even though the Tea Act was going to mean cheaper tea for the colonists, what radical politicians like Adams are saying is, this is just a way to seduce the colonists into paying taxes for which they hadn't given consent. Meanwhile, writers in New York City and Philadelphia were warning American colonists what would happen if they were to allow this tea to land. A writer using the pseudonym Hamden, who might have been the New York City patriot Alexander McDougall, a Continental Army officer, argued that the East India Company's monopoly on East India trade was corrupting British politics and the British Constitution. He writes, the purchase of the company's iniquities, tea, is being sent to the colonies. The profit of that is being used to support tyranny in the East, in India, and enslave the West, right? So the East India Company is just bad for the empire. And if the American colonists were to give up on this question of whether Parliament could tax the colonists without their consent, the Americans would wind up no better than, racism alert, than helpless Asiatics, right? In other words, like if American colonists want to think of themselves as being better than Asian people, we can't allow the tea to land. Other writers added that if Americans accepted this East India Company, which was a monopoly company having these special privileges to trade to the American colonies, further monopolies were sure to follow, right? In the same way that there was a bit of a slippery slope argument about no taxation without representation, there's also a slippery slope argument about allowing monopoly companies to operate in the American colonies, right? So John Dickinson, writing under the pseudonym Rusticus, perfectly appropriate. I'm staying in the Delaware room tonight, so I got to mention John Dickinson. He agrees with Hamden. He says, it's not the paltry sum of 3 pence that's being demanded by Parliament. It's the principle upon which it is demanded that we are contending against. And so, a lot of these writers were emphasizing both the monopoly piece and the tax piece of this. So the Bostonians are also worried about these things. Smugglers and legitimate merchants alike cared about the East India Company monopoly and the taxes. They had been doing okay since 1767, but the Tea Act was threatening to upend this arrangement. And for the Bostonians, it was also a little bit personal. 2 of the agents that the East India Company had picked to receive the tea were were sons of Governor Thomas Hutchinson, right? And Richard Clark and Sons, one of the other firms that was appointed to receive the tea, were related to the Hutchinsons by marriage, right? And Hutchinson at this point is like the least popular man in Boston because Benjamin Franklin had made a few of his letters public earlier that year, including one that urged the British government to manage Boston with a firm hand, even if it required, quote, an abridgment of what are called English liberties. So in other words, like, doesn't matter if you have to curtail the Bostonians' liberties, you got to come down on these guys a little harder. And the Bostonians are like, what the heck? You're supposed to be representing us, and this is what you're writing to your bosses over in England? We thought you were a son of Massachusetts. I mean, he's descended from Anne Hutchinson, right? Like his family's been around as long as the Adamses or any other, patriotic family in Massachusetts. Over the previous years, Parliament had decided to begin. The other thing was that over the previous years, Parliament had decided, okay, instead of having the Massachusetts House of Representatives pay the salary of Hutchinson, the governor, and certain judges and things like that, instead they'll say, oh, well, actually, to pay their salaries, we're going to use the money earned from the tea duty and these other obnoxious duties. So now Hutchinson is not accountable to the House of Representatives and the people. He's accountable to these imperial officials that are trying to enforce these taxes. And so it's not just the tax, but the fact that this tax money is then going into the pockets of their hated enemy, while the profits are being earned by his sons and his in-laws, right? So, so the Americans see this as a kind of conspiracy to tyrannically enslave them, right? They use all this really big language about being slaves, which is a topic I'm going to return to in a bit. So, so what I argue is that there were really, we think, oh, what was the cause of the Boston Tea Party? No taxation without representation. But I would argue that that's one of four causes, right? So no taxation without representation, the use of the revenue from American taxes, including the tax on tea, to support imperial officials in Massachusetts, this East India Company monopoly business. And then the fourth cause is actually peer pressure, right? Pressure from New York City and Philadelphia. These were the years when the committees of correspondence are starting to become active, and none of the radicals wanted to see a repeat of the failure and distrust and recriminations that had followed the collapse of the non-importation agreements that had happened back in 1770. Hamden, this pseudonymous writer I was talking about before, he warns in October of 1773, he says, remember, right, the non-importation agreement is still obligatory on all the parties to it. And whoever shall abet or aid in the violating of those agreements is an enemy to commerce and liberty. Then in December of 1773, right, as the Boston Tea Party is about to happen, William Palfrey, his family's papers are at Harvard, he's traveling around New York and Philadelphia, and he writes back to an associate in Boston. He was probably writing to John Hancock, actually. And he says, make sure you stay firm on this business with the East India Company tea. He says, if by any means you should relax. In other words, if by any means the Boston Sons of Liberty should relax or fall back in any degree from your late resolutions, right? Your resolutions that the Tea Act is bad and the tea shouldn't land, et cetera, et cetera. He says, if you guys, don't hold strong, he says, you will be a scorn and reproach among your neighbors and never more be able to retrieve the public confidence. Now is the time to convince the world that the people of Boston can act with virtue and resolution. So in other words, this was in doubt, right? People thought the Bostonians were a bunch of punks who weren't going to, hold up their end, right? They're suspicious of Boston. And that totally blows our mind, because what we're used to thinking is, oh, Boston is where it all happens. The Stamp Act riots, the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party. They're always, the vanguard of the resistance, right? Where everything starts. But in 1773, it's the radicals in the middle colonies, right? New York and Philadelphia are like, we're not sure about these Bostonians. We don't really know what they're going to do. So there's tension, there's suspense at this moment of December 16th, 1773. So now I'm going to go back and speak in Joshua Wyeth's voice again. He says, we came to a sudden determination to make sure work of it by throwing it all overboard, right? So, this is the moment, right? Like where the Bostonians feel like they can't send the tea back to London, and they feel that they can't land it because then the New Yorkers and Philadelphians will hate them. And so there's really only one other place for the tea to go, which is down, right? And so Wyeth says, we agreed, in order as much as we might prevent ourselves from being discovered, to wear ragged clothes and disfigure ourselves as much as possible. After we had pledged our honor that we would not reveal our secret plan, we separated. At the appointed time, we all met according to agreement. We were dressed to resemble Indians as much as possible. We had smeared our faces with grease and soot or lampblack. We should not have known each other save by our voices, and we surely resembled devils from the bottomless pit rather than men. So the guys place sentries on the wharves and ships. There's a crowd of thousands watching. The Royal Navy is watching this happen. The British troops on Castle Island are watching this happen. And so the men, in Wyeth's words, proceeded readily to business. They boarded the ships. They demanded that the captain or his representatives open the hatchways. They grab hoisting tackle and ropes. Some of the men jump into the hold and pass the tea chests over to the tackle. The men hoisted the chests on deck, smashed them open with axes, raised them to the railings, and dumped the contents overboard. This is why I like this picture better than the Currier and Ives picture, right? You know, don't believe the hype about them throwing whole crates of tea into the water. That's not what happened. They chopped the crates open and dumped the loose tea into the water. We stirred briskly in the business, Wyeth wrote. Remember, he's remembering like this from when he was 15 years old. From the moment we left our dressing room, we were merry in an undertone at the idea of making so large a cup of tea for the fishes, but we were as still as the case would admit. I never worked harder in my life. So the job was done in about 2 or 3 hours. It was dark because it was December in Boston. Sun goes down pretty early, but the job is done in about 2 or 3 hours. The men had dumped 46 tons of tea. And people also often ask me, well, what was that worth? You know, I could tell you 9,600 British pounds sterling, but that doesn't really mean much to us. And so what I usually say is the amount that Paul Revere paid for his house, right? You can still visit the Paul Revere house in the North End of Boston. The amount that Paul Revere paid for his house was about what a ton of tea cost. So if you multiply the value of Paul Revere's house by 46, that's the value of what the Bostonians destroyed on the night of December 16th, 1773. And so, of course, as we know, or we think we know, right, this is now going to be really important, right? Clearly, on some level now, this is a big deal. Nobody can ignore it. This is somehow going to be the catalyst for something big happening. And what happens months later, right, because it takes a while for news of this to get to London, 4 to 6 weeks, and then for London to decide what to do, and then 4 to 6 weeks back. So by spring, right, the Americans find out what's going to happen, and it's the coercive acts, right? It wasn't called the intolerable acts at the time, but you've probably heard that term in school. A set of particularly harsh punishments that was also going to involve the reoccupation of Boston by British troops, which had said goodbye after the Boston Massacre in March of 1770. Now in 1774, they're going to be back. The Boston Port Act said, Parliament is going to close the port of Boston to all business and throw everybody out of work until the town repays the East India Company for the tea. The Bostonians say, that's not fair. The town didn't do it. It was just a bunch of Indians who did it. How, you know, how dare you, you know, but Parliament knows, like, look, Boston was sanctioning this. We're going to punish the entire town for this, right? In the same way that an elementary school teacher might be like, well, I don't know who, you know, who threw that, but I'm going to punish the entire class until somebody steps forward. The Massachusetts Government Act restricted town meetings and made the governor's council into executive appointees, whereas previously these guys had been chosen by the Massachusetts House of Representatives. In other words, the governor's council used to be more accountable to the people. Now it's really only going to answer to the governor and his imperial bosses. The Administration of Justice Act was going to give British officials the right to stand trial for capital crimes elsewhere. So in other words, they could find a friendlier jury than they might have gotten in Boston. There was also the Quartering Act, which is misunderstood and I'm not going to get into, and the Quebec Act, right? So sometimes I'll talk to people and they'll say, oh, the Boston Tea Party, that was such a dramatic moment that it probably galvanized the colonists into, revolution. But no, that's completely wrong, right? It's the British response, it's the crackdown, it's the coercive acts that galvanizes the colonists and begins to lead to more widespread resistance to British imperial policy. That's what gets Jefferson writing his his initial, now I can't believe I'm blanking on the name of his big 1774 document that he then cribs from for the Declaration of Independence. Anyway, Parliament's goal had been to isolate Boston and Massachusetts, but as it turns out, this backfires, right? You have, this is a cartoon representing the way, the Bostonians are starving in this cage. And so the other colonists kind of come around and say, we'll help you, we'll send you food. We know that your port is closed to all trade. We will find a way to be charitable towards you and float you until Parliament repeals the coercive act. So other towns in Massachusetts and then other colonies rally behind Boston and Massachusetts. You start to have more widespread boycotts. You have the meeting of the First Continental Congress at the end of the summer of 1774. You have the illegal gathering of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, and meanwhile they're telling New Englanders, all right, like, you know how you're supposed to have militia day, you know, a few times a year, and we all get drunk and have fun. Now drill, take it seriously. We're going to be getting you gunpowder from Europe, you know, and you better know how to use it. Massachusetts crowds begin closing courthouses, refusing to allow the hated mandamus counselors, right, appointed under this new Massachusetts Government Act. They refuse to allow them to take their seats. They force a lot of them to resign or send them fleeing to British-occupied Boston. And so what you have is Massachusetts farmers essentially starting to deny that Parliament has any authority in Massachusetts anymore. Eventually, what all this is going to lead to is shots fired at Lexington and Concord in April of 1775 and the Declaration of Independence in 1776. Of course, there's a lot more I could say, but like, right, you know, we're talking about the Tea Party today. This is going to be the eventual outcome of it. And so, you know, that bigger picture story you can read about in the fabulous, like, you know, first really good scholarly book on the Boston Tea Party, which was Benjamin Woods Labourie's book in 1966, right? He tells what I consider the kind of imperial story of the Boston Tea Party and what becomes a kind of national story about the Boston Tea Party. So what room did that leave for me with this book from 2010? The reason why I wrote the book, I had a few goals. One was I felt that nobody had emphasized these four causes sufficiently, right? Monopoly, taxes, you know, peer pressure, et cetera. And the other thing is that even though Laborie had told an imperial and national story, I wanted to tell a story that was both more local and more global, right? So what do I mean by that? I wanted to tell a local story that would, you know, give us a textured sense about Boston, its religion, its economy, the fights over the Massachusetts Charter, its riotous history, the lull in politics from 1770 to 1773. I wanted to make sure people understood Boston and what made it tick in the years leading up to the Revolution. I also wanted to talk about the men who supported the landing of the tea, the consignees. This is Richard Clark and Sons, right? One of his daughters married John Singleton Copley. So John Singleton Copley painted this beautiful portrait of Clark and his family. So I wanted to kind of say, okay, who are the consignees? Who are the customs officers? Who are the ship owners? You know, what's motivating the governor, so that we understand not just the people who were protesting, but also the people who were trying to kind of enforce the law that Parliament was passing and make the empire continue to run. I also wanted to look at, obviously, the more famous political actors, guys like Samuel Adams, Joseph Warren, Thomas Young, Josiah Quincy, right? Who are the leaders of the movement? What made them effective? What made them able to not just motivate their fellow elites, but also people throughout Boston's social spectrum? And so, of course, one of the groups that I'm really interested in were the participants in the Boston Tea Party. I have a list at the end of the book of 100 participants. Right. My rule was that if nobody wrote about you or your ancestor participating in the Boston Tea Party until after 1855, I was like, you probably made up the story. It's a little too late. We're not going to count that. And if I found contradictory evidence suggesting that an earlier story, you know, was saying that someone was at the Tea Party who wasn't there, I kind of cut that out as well. Even so, it's a pretty unreliable list, right? The only person who we know for sure from a contemporary account that was there was a horse dealer from Charlestown, Massachusetts, named Charles Connor. And the only reason we know his name is that they caught him during the Tea Party pocketing some tea for himself. And they said, that's not what we're about. We're not thieves. We're trying to destroy this for a political reason. And so they beat him up and they tear his coat off and they nail it to a post in front of his door and say, you know, this guy was trying to mess with us. You know, he's the only one who we really know for sure was there. Everything else comes from stories like Wyeth's that was told much later. You know, a story that I sometimes tell audiences is that my parents were camp counselors in Sussex County, New Jersey, and they had 24 hours off, and the concert at Woodstock was happening. And they're like, oh, okay, we've got 24 hours off. Let's go drive there and, you know, participate in the concert of our generation, you know. And they hit a bunch of traffic. They said, we don't have enough time off. We've got to get back to the kids. And so they turned around and didn't go to Woodstock. And the reason I tell this story is that there are probably a lot of people who know people from that generation who are like, my parents were there, of course, you know, blah, blah, blah. But I try and say, like, I'm going to tell you this less exciting story to show my honesty. Do we really think that if you had a parent in Boston in 1773 and it's 1830 and everybody's like, back in those days, men were men, and oh, your grandparents were from Boston. Like, did your grandfather participate in the Boston Tea Party? There's a lot of temptation to be like, yes, my grandfather was there, and so you have all these stories that you can't really trust. Anyway, what I did was I made the best guess I could about the people who were said to have been at the Boston Tea Party, and I created a kind of social and political profile of them. How old were they? What were their jobs? Had they participated in politics before? And so tried to come up with a profile. Who was Joshua Wyeth? Who were the 2 Harvard graduates who were there, the merchants that were there, the apprentices and rope makers and caulkers, and these people who made Boston run? Who were these guys that coordinated one way or another? And I have some interesting theories about how the Boston Tea Party was coordinated, but who were the guys that they picked to say, we trust you, you do it, right? Esther Forbes creates the scene to this in Johnny Tremaine, right? Of like, oh, you're going to be one of the guys that does this, right? But like, she has to do this on the basis of these sources that, I don't know if you've ever seen the show The Wire, right? Here's another Chesapeake reference, right? But they say you don't take notes on a criminal conspiracy, right? So if they're not taking notes on this criminal conspiracy to dump the tea, historians have nothing to read, right? So we have to kind of fill in the gaps based on what we know and based on these recollections that often come many years later. But I'm interested in the little guys, the guys who actually do the hard work of dumping this tea. And I'm also interested, by the way, in the involvement of Boston women, right? Tea, right, in the 1760s and 1770s, and for many years before that, actually, was a bit of a lightning rod for women and for the gender politics of the time, right? Women got together at tea time. And so the male chauvinists of the day were totally disturbed by this. What could happen at this tea table where there are only ladies? Gossip, scandal, overspending on tea things, right? A visiting lawyer from London was hanging out in Boston, and he writes about the Boston women. The ladies here visit, drink tea, and indulge every little piece of gentility to the height of the mode, to the height of fashion. And they neglect the affairs of their families with as good grace as the finest ladies in London, right? This deeply biting, sarcastic comment of like, look at these women wasting their time, drinking tea. But when it comes to boycotting tea, women as consumers of tea are going to be crucial. And so women are attacked in the press from both sides, either for failing to uphold the boycott and continuing to drink tea, or for joining the boycott and participating in politics where women were said to have no place. But women defended themselves in print as well. So you can read these really interesting exchanges about gender during this political moment as well. So I'll tell stories like Abigail Dwight. Abigail Dwight was a 48-year-old former headmistress of a boarding school for Mohawk girls in Stockbridge. And she was visiting Boston in June of 1769. The first wave of boycotts is going on. And she writes to her daughter and she's like, I'm feeling ill because I had to drink coffee in the afternoon because I was at a high liberty house and they wouldn't serve tea. Except for the government officials in Boston, not a drop of tea will one soul of them drink. She can't get tea anywhere for love or money. But she herself was unwilling to give up tea completely. She says, at home, I can still drink it, right? So as long as it's not public, she can keep on drinking tea. Clara Barton, whose name you might recognize as the founder of the American Red Cross, she remembered hearing from her grandmother, Dorothy, and from her great aunt, Martha Moore Ballard, who's featured in Laurel Thatcher-Aldrich's A Midwife's Tale. She remembered them telling her a story that they would secretly sip tea in the cellar while their great uncle was away, because he was a Whig and he's like, no tea's going to be drunk in my house. And so they're like, all right, let's wait for him to go to work and we'll go into the cellar and we'll drink our tea. So some of women's fondest memories from 1760s and 1770s are these little family rebellions, right? Drinking tea while the men of the house were away. So we see both patterns. We see some women quietly using these tea boycotts as a platform to stage their own little family rebellions against their husbands, while others joined men's more vocal rebellion against the tea. We believe in this too. We're going to participate in this boycott. We wore homespun cloth during the boycotts. We're going to abstain from drinking tea. We're going to show how virtuous we are by giving up our own private selfish interests in order to join in this boycott. So women do both things, but of course they're criticized for doing both things. And historians of the Revolutionary period are interested, like, is this a period where women, by getting more politically involved, could they have gotten more civil rights, marital rights, et cetera, et cetera? It all goes to pieces. Unfortunately, it's not, it doesn't end up being an optimistic story, but we do see flashes of real participation by women. They helped, and including during the Tea Party itself, they helped men prepare for the Tea Party. They connected some of the Tea Party participants to one another by marriage. Women passed down Tea Party stories So there's all sorts of things I could say about that. Anyway, I said I was going to tell both a local story of the Boston Tea Party, which you can read the book, find out more about. In what sense is it a global story? So one way that I usually put this is, here you have the East India Company, which has, England initially in 1600 and then later Great Britain, gives the East India Company a monopoly on all trade east of the Cape of Good Hope. By the 1770s, they were increasingly becoming a ruling power over more and more people in South Asia. Their principal crop that they sold, tea, was farmed by East Asians. The Chinese didn't necessarily drink their tea with sugar, but when Europeans begin adopting it after 1600, they have to mix it with sugar, and sugar, of course, is farmed by enslaved Afro-Caribbeans. Right, but tea is becoming more and more fashionable about Europeans, also becomes cheaper, so drunk not just by upper class Europeans and American colonists, but eventually by lower class, working class people as well. And when the Bostonians protest it, of course, they dress as Native Americans. So now here we have, right, a very global story, right, that I tried to convey in the book. The slavery angle is an interesting one. I wanted to talk a little bit more about that, right? You couldn't drink tea if you were European without sugar. It wasn't done. You had to have your sugar, right? The three caffeinated beverages of the early modern era, right? In Yemen and Ethiopia, where they first start farming coffee, they don't drink it with sugar, but when the Europeans adopt it, they have to mix it with sugar. The Mexicans, when they drank chocolate, right, were not necessarily making it with sugar, but these famous Swiss and French chocolatiers, right? Like, it's got sugar, right? So, and tea similarly, right? It had been coming over Asia in caravans, for centuries, but it's only once it starts to become more popular in Western Europe, sugar is essential. And if you think about New England, right? What is New England for? They catch fish, they build ships. What is all that for? It's to sell codfish, cheap codfish, to the Caribbean so that the enslaved people have something to eat, right? It's to build ships, right? Like, this hurts our feelings as Americans, but the 13 American colonies were not the most important colonies in the Western Hemisphere to the British Empire in 1776. The Caribbean, where they grow sugar, this white gold, way more important to the British economy. The reason the North American colonies exist is to grow food or catch fish to feed the enslaved people who are cutting cane, right? Like, that's what it's for. Right, and so New England's economy, right, like the initial thing that they protest is the Sugar Act, right? Sugar, molasses, rum, right? All that is stuff that's grown by slaves, and the New Englanders are making money from it. So I've been talking all day, all evening about tea boycotts. Was anybody thinking about boycotting sugar in order to protest slavery in 1773? And the answer is no, right? Nobody hits on that idea really until the 1790s among abolitionists in England, actually. But there was some anti-slavery sentiment in Massachusetts on the eve of the Tea Party, right? James Otis had written against slavery in 1765. The Massachusetts people talked about the Somerset case back in England in 1772, where a Black person says, hey, somebody tried to bring me as a slave into England, but there is no positive law of slavery in England, so I'm free. I have the right of habeas corpus, right? And the judge kind of says, yeah, I guess actually you do. Like Caribbean and American colonies might have slavery, but there's no slavery here. In England, you're free. And so, the Massachusetts people are like, James Swan, who later becomes a Boston Tea Party participant, we think he actually writes an anti-slavery pamphlet the year before in 1772. Harvard students were talking about banning slavery at their commencement exercises in 1773. Phyllis Wheatley becomes a transatlantic sensation, as and her book, right, first book written by an African-American woman, and comes out same year, 1773, published in London. Black people petitioned the Massachusetts legislature to end slavery, or at least the slave trade, in 1773. In the town of Medfield, they write to Boston and they say, we're upset about violations of the Massachusetts Charter. We're upset about the Tea Act, and we don't like slavery either. And if you could do something about banning that, we'd be thrilled. I could talk about the Roach family, right? The Roach family were the ones who owned the Dartmouth ship, the first of the tea ships. They were mostly whale oil merchants, right? Francis Roach, right? He's like, I can't believe they had this tea cargo aboard and now my ship is delayed. All I want to do is leave port with my whale oil aboard so that I can make money on it in London. The Roaches were a Quaker family. And so they had purchased the indentures of enslaved people. They had convinced fellow Quakers to give up slaving. They had paid for lawsuits, freedom suits, for enslaved people seeking freedom. Some historians claim that the Prince Boston case that the Roach family was involved in effectively ended slavery on the island of Nantucket. So in this search for freedom in a world of tea and sugar, maybe it was the Roaches rather than the Massachusetts Patriots who had the right idea about freedom. Right? Because I argue in the book that if anything, the Boston Tea Party kind of kills the anti-slavery movement by forcing everybody to focus on the coercive acts and what Parliament was doing, and by giving Massachusetts a lot of good reasons to be nice to Southerners, right? To white Southerners, right? So slavery was eliminated in Massachusetts during the American Revolution, but it's eliminated kind of quietly. There is no day of jubilee or anything. The story that we're more familiar with, right, is 1850s Boston, right? The Boston Vigilance Community rescuing fugitive slaves like Shadrach Minkins from U.S. Marshals. Theodore Parker, in talking about the Minkins rescue, says it's the most noble deed done in Boston since the destruction of tea in 1773. Right. So in that later memory, right, the Boston anti-slavery movement is associated with the Boston Tea Party, but the actual Boston Tea Party, I think, actually stopped a burgeoning anti-slavery movement in its tracks. I want to leave a lot of time for questions, and I don't know how much time I've chewed up yet. So, I could talk about some of the great new work that's been published. My colleague David Wallstreicher has a new biography of Phyllis Wheatley that made the New York Times list of top 100 books. Jane Merritt and Mary Beth Norton have come out with good books on tea since my book. There's a new book by James Fichter. You've probably maybe heard about his book that's coming out from Cornell University Press. Maybe it came out this month. There's really interesting new work that's been done on the East India Company, on the American trade with China, all sorts of really interesting stuff. And I want to talk about my new book just for a second, because it wasn't until the end of writing this new book that just came out in January that I realized that I was writing about something really similar to the Boston Tea Party, actually. Because as with the Boston Tea Party, when you're talking about the Great New York Fire of 1776, you had a group of impassioned, radical, highly motivated men and women, actually, at least some of whom were zealous New Englanders, right, who coordinated with one another to destroy, right, out of necessity for the sake of a continent-wide cause. Right. I started to really see the parallels. I don't know if any of you are familiar with John Bell's Boston 1775 website. Great resource. He was kind of doing like a little mini review of my book, and he's like, yeah, it's interesting to hear me talk about these things at the same time. He's like, the Tea Party was this kind of carefully controlled destruction, but the New York Fire was supposed to get out of control. The men who destroyed the tea were Boston Whigs, who were selected for their reliability. But some of the people who were involved in burning New York City were kind of more outside the American power structure. There was a mixed race man, there was a woman, etc., but who were still willing to sacrifice themselves for this cause, right? Because a couple of people are actually thrown into the fire by British soldiers. So again, there are interesting parallels. The events are different in many ways, but I really started to see some parallels. The other thing that I want to talk about is how the Tea Party's iconic significance over the years, right? Here we are at the 250th anniversary, 3 days from now. I just wonder sometimes, what do we think after January 6th about people trespassing and destroying property for the sake of what they think is right? How do we contextualize the crowd action of the revolutionary movement so that it inspires our democratic spirit and our Republican virtue, but not what 18th century people would have called licentiousness, right? When mobs turn and get out of control. What I'll say for now is that for at least 200 years, people have celebrated, but they have also debated and distorted the memory of this event that helped to bring about the American Revolution. I want to give some examples here. Hold on. I have this whole list, but my notes are a little bit more jumbled than I'd like. Hold on a minute. Oh no, I might not have it. Oh, here we go. Okay, great. So yeah, what I want to talk about is the remarkably diverse set of examples of Boston Tea Party inspired protests. So one of the earliest ones is 1824. There was a protest against some kind of federal tariff, and people started calling for a boycott, as was done in the Boston Tea Affair. So, let's use similar tactics. In the 1830s, there was a labor movement leader named Seth Luther who defended himself against the accusation that labor unions were dangerous combinations by saying, hey, weren't the disguised Bostonians a combination? What's wrong with combinations? That's how the people express themselves. In 1833, the Pequot Methodist minister, William Apess, and other Pequots were arrested when they tried to prevent white men from taking wood off of Mashpee lands. And so their lawyers like, hey, the Mashpee revolt, just like the Boston Tea Party, right? Like, what do you hate America, right? Like, we got to celebrate these people for this protest. The Boston Tea Party was also invoked against landlords in upstate New York, against banks, right? It was used as a kind of touchstone for a critique of powerful economic interests. But it goes even further than that. So, for instance, in 1849, the Sons of Temperance urged members to throw the cargoes of King alcohol overboard. And Abraham Lincoln actually defended some female clients who destroyed a saloon in 1854 by comparing their action to the Boston Tea Party. This is when he was still a country lawyer. But when William Randolph Hearst spoke out against prohibition in the 1920s, he also invoked the Boston Tea Party, right? Protesting prohibition is like the Boston Tea Party. So wet or dry, right? You claim the Boston Tea Party as your mantle. In 1873, women suffrage advocates used the 100th anniversary of the Boston Tea Party to complain about their own taxation without representation because they still couldn't vote. By the 20th century, women suffragists were advocating boycotts and even property destruction on behalf of women's right to vote. In 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. offers the Boston Tea Party as an example of civil disobedience in his letter from a Birmingham jail. While in 1966, Robert F. Williams used it as a rallying cry for even more violent action on behalf of African-American civil rights. Burn, baby, burn. And yet, in 1915, the anti-Semitic Knights of Mary Fagin justified the killing of Leo Frank in Georgia by citing the Boston Tea Party as precedent. In the 1920s, William Joseph Simmons, who was the imperial wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, he read back into history. He says, "Oh, remember those guys in the Boston Tea Party? They were animated by Ku Klux spirit." And when Salt Lake City, Utah tried to outlaw masked assemblies, a Klan representative responded by saying, hey, Klansmen are patriots just like the Boston Tea Party. Those guys too donned masks, donned disguises in order to deliver their country from oppression, right? So the Tea Party can be invoked on behalf of civil rights, but it can also be invoked on behalf of white supremacy and anti-Semitism. Since almost nobody was seriously hurt at the Boston Tea Party, except for Charles Connor, who I mentioned before, the Boston Tea Party often appeals to advocates of a grand global tradition of nonviolent civil disobedience. So, for instance, when the British government in South Africa forced the Indian migrants who were resident there to be registered and fingerprinted, Gandhi led the Indian community there to burn their registration cards in 1908 as a protest. And a Daily Mail correspondent in London compared that action to the Boston Tea Party. When Sun Yat-sen of the Kuomintang threatened to seize customs revenues at Canton in late 1923, and the United States sent warships to intervene, Sun Yat-sen sent a cable to the Americans saying, hey, we have to stop this money from going to Beijing, where it'll be used to buy arms to kill us, just as your forefathers stopped taxation from going into English coffers by throwing English tea into Boston Harbor, right? So people around the world were familiar with this precedent, with this example. Since the 1970s, people generally invoke the Boston Tea Party as a form of tax protest, but not only. But there's some disturbing examples. In 1988, a Detroit radio talk show host named Roy Fox launched a campaign to send tea bags to Washington, D.C. to protest a pay raise for congressmen and senior federal employees. On April 16th of 1990, which was tax day that year, 3 libertarians drove a firebomb to a post office in Royal Oak, Michigan, wrapped it in a tea bag, addressed it to the IRS, and put it in a mail bin where it exploded and injured a postal worker. In 1997, a couple of congressmen from Louisiana and Colorado dumped copies of the federal tax code into Boston Harbor to complain about taxes. But these Tea Party memories are not just exclusively tax protests. So, for instance, in September 2001, in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, the Animal Liberation Front set fire at a primate lab in New Mexico that did $1 million worth of damage. And in the January of 2002, the Earth Liberation Front cell set a University of Minnesota genetics lab on fire. In response, corporate groups, the FBI, members of Congress, conservative commentators said this was eco-terrorism. And in counter to that, the ALF spokesman, David Barbarash, said, I mean, what was the Boston Tea Party if not a massive act of property destruction? Property damage is a legitimate political tool called economic sabotage, and it's meant to attack businesses and corporations who are profiting from the exploitation, murder, and torture of either humans or animals or the planet. So to call these acts terrorism is ludicrous. And this issue has come up again in a recent film, How to Blow Up a Pipeline, right? Certain kinds of protest, no different from the Boston Tea Party. In July of 2020, the right-wing legal scholar Jonathan Turley objected to the many opinions that he'd heard on CNN, including by Don Lemon, who has since departed from there, and in campus newspapers, defending property destruction during the Black Lives Matter protests by comparing those protests to the Boston Tea Party. Turley does not like that analogy. When state legislatures passed anti-protest bills in the following year, Representative Jim Clyburn of Democrats from South Carolina said, hey, America was a democracy that started off as a protest that was called the Boston Tea Party. We all know about January 6, 2021, when a crowd of supporters attacked the U.S. Capitol. Reed Christensen, who was recently convicted of 4 felonies and 4 misdemeanors for his actions that day, he previously ran for governor of Oregon, and he said, when I came back from the January 6th rally, I felt like I had participated in the Boston Tea Party 2.0. Later in that year, a columnist in Spokane would say, hey, those of us who don't like vaccine mandates, we're just like the Boston Tea Party protesters. So you see all these different analogies that are used. I'm going to wind up this list. In January of this year, the Open Markets Institute celebrated the Department of Justice's antitrust suit against Google by saying the American people have taken many brave stands against monopoly, going back to the Tea Party. And the most recent protest I found was in Boston of July of 2023, when executives of the cannabis company Maramed boarded a replica 1800 schooner, the Liberty Star, and dumped chests labeled weed overboard in what they called the THC Party, a protest of a section of the tax code that heavily taxed legal cannabis businesses. A few weeks before that, a Trumpist in New York who was outraged about new restrictions on pizza ovens in New York City, staged a protest in front of City Hall. He says, our city schools produce the dumbest kids, and the woke-ass punks who run New York City are afraid of pizza. It's a damn shame. You heard of the Boston Tea Party? This is the New York Pizza Party. Give us pizza or give us death, he said, while throwing slices of pizza at City Hall. So while it's easy for us to think of the Boston Tea Party as a distant, gauzy event, as heroic, patriotic, and revolutionary, it's worth remembering that there's some chaos involved in this as well. And real violence that had occurred in the weeks leading up to 1773 that also gets channeled in some of these later protests. So I think the Boston Tea Party is a memory that belongs to all of us, but it should also be maybe an uncomfortable, or at least memory for some of us, right? Something where, well, do we want to, do we want to live in an orderly society, or do we want to live in a society where anybody who is upset with the law feels that they can break it? On the other hand, right, if the government is doing the oppressing by denying civil rights to Black people or to women, right, maybe it's time to break the law, make more of a ruckus, right? But where do you draw the line, right? I assume that, most people, there's nobody who would agree with both the Black Lives Matter protests and the January 6th riots. Like, that would be an odd sort of politics if you supported both of them. And yet they're both invoking the Boston Tea Party, right, on behalf of the protests and the results of those protests. But here's why I think we ought to get this history right. And I want to conclude with another story from the pension records that I got to see the originals of today, which is the story of Samuel Noel. In 1773, Samuel Noel was a 29-year-old ship carpenter or boat builder who had lived in both Boston and Newburyport. But by 1831, he was living in Wolfsboro, New Hampshire. And this is what he wrote to Congress. And in some cases, he writes in the third person, but I'm going to switch it to first person to make it clear. He says, I was one of those who periled themselves in that celebrated achievement, the destruction of a cargo of tea in the harbor of Boston. I was then young, enterprising, and courageous, and I presume my broadaxe was never more dexterously used than while I was staving the chests and throwing them overboard. I view the destruction of this tea as the principal initiative scene which preceded and powerfully influenced and produced that civil rupture between Great Britain and her then American colonies, which has resulted in the independence of the United States and its unprecedented consequences. Noel then goes on to describe his amazing war stories. He had escaped from occupied Boston. He had served aboard 2 privateers. He was captured at sea and then imprisoned for 16 months in Halifax. He spent 3 of those months in shackles as punishment for attempting to escape. He contracted yellow fever and then recovered. And then he and some other prisoners were being transported from Halifax, Nova Scotia, to British-occupied New York City. But then a storm separated their ship from the rest of the convoy, and he led a mutiny. And then they led the boat back to Marblehead, and then they were all free and safe. But now he's winding up his story, and he says, now I'm 86 years old, and I'm no longer able to work. I have no means whatever to subsist, but I'm wholly dependent on the bounty of my friends for my daily support. And he says, look, at the time that I was actively and zealously jeopardizing myself for my country, I was happy and my country was miserable. But I was happy in the conscious discharge of a duty paramount to all others. But now the scene is reversed. My country is rich and happy, but I am poor and miserable. And so anyway, I think we owe it to Samuel Noel, to Joshua Wyeth, and all the rest of these Boston Tea Party participants to make sure that we know the story of the Boston Tea Party, why it was righteous and why it was dangerous. And if we can somehow hold both of those ideas in our head, maybe we can kind of figure out a way to get through the problems we face today. So thank you, everybody, and I really look forward to any questions you have.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating. I evidently have been laboring under the misconception that the Boston Tea Party was something of a clandestine affair, people coming in the middle of the night, throwing things over. But it sounds like there were thousands of people watching this.
You got to remember, it's all about plausible deniability. I'll explain, but yeah, go on.
If that's the case, clearly it wasn't secret. Why didn't the colonial governor try to intervene? The military wasn't there, but clearly the militia was there. Was he looking at this as an opportunity to enact more punitive measures afterwards? So it was really a convenient excuse?
That's what the Patriots later accuse him of, right? They say this is all Hutchinson's fault, and now the crackdown is all his fault. The militia there was militia, but there were British redcoats on Castle Island in the harbor, right? Like the governor had troops and the Navy at his disposal. And this is the explanation from the Massachusetts Government Act. He cannot act without the approval of his council. And the council is not going to approve of British soldiers and sailors firing on Massachusetts colonists, which would have been a terrible idea anyway. But the council is certainly not going to approve that because the council is in part appointed by the Massachusetts House of Representatives, which is in turn elected by the people. That's why Parliament says this arrangement won't do. Let's change the Massachusetts charter so that the governor can be empowered with the help of with the consent of a friendly council to do what needs to be done to enforce the acts of Parliament. We don't want that situation to repeat, because that is what Governor Francis Bernard and then Governor Thomas Hutchinson had been complaining about since 1765. They're like, we can't enforce any of these acts that you're trying to pass because we have no way of putting teeth in these laws. They'll beat up customs officials, they'll beat up informers. These Bostonians will not allow these, these things to be enforced. And so the smuggling is going to continue unless you're willing to take a firmer hand. Now, Boston is only a town of about 16,000 people, and you can imagine that fewer than a quarter of those would have been adult men. So pretty much everybody knew who was boarding those ships and dumping the tea. These Indian disguises, whatever, you know how your neighbor walks or how your cousin carries himself. Everybody knew who these guys were. The disguises are meant to be symbolic, right? Even if you know who we are, don't tell, right? If you're ever, called to testify, right? Like, these were not Bostonians. The Boston town meeting had basically officially dissolved and said, we're not dealing with this tea issue. Instead, it was the body of the people gathering in the Old South Meeting House, people from Charlestown, Roxbury, Dorchester, Boston, Cambridge, like, we're all just here as interested citizens. We want to know what to do about the tea. And even that meeting, right? Samuel Adams, Thomas Young, Joseph Warren, John Hancock, on December 16th, they all ostentatiously stay behind at the head of that meeting. And they say, no, stay and listen to all, our speeches. But instead, some guys have come in Indian disguises, right? Outsiders to the meeting, right? In theory, who say, we're all going down to Griffin's Wharf. We're going to make a cup of tea for the fishes. And they say, everybody follow us down to Griffin's Wharf. So the leaders all stay behind so that they have plausible deniability. And a crowd of people watches as this group of Mohawks, who everybody knows are Bostonians, but we're pretending that they are not Bostonians, while they destroy the tea, right? And do so in a way that's supposed to not get Boston in trouble. And not right, plausible deniability is kind of the key there. So there were two problems. One is the kind of code of don't tell that's prevalent among the colonists, and the other is that the British imperial functionaries have no power to enforce the laws that they have been enjoined to enforce. Hutchinson and Bernard were essentially in an impossible position, and they keep trying to point this out to their bosses in Parliament. But in Parliament, they get increasingly frustrated. Why don't these Americans want to pay their taxes? We just fought this, the 7 Years' War on behalf of these American colonists. We went into massive debt. We have continuing troop commitments in what we would now call the Midwest, around in the Great Lakes region. Like, can't the American colonists like pony up a little money like to pay for their own defense? But the American colonists are like, nope, we're not represented in Parliament. We think that's unfair, and they just, they can't agree. And this conflict is this constitutional conflict is kind of plays out with bare knuckles and hot tar on the streets of Boston and other American cities. See, I'm better on my feet.
I just talk a bit about the representation part. So what was the concept that was being floated when the British were potentially still listening? Was it to have members of Parliament elected in the colonies and sent to London? What was the concept that would have ticked the box for representation?
Yeah, it wouldn't have worked, right? Because any American colonists would have been outnumbered in Parliament, right? Or they already had lobbyists like Benjamin Franklin, but like the longer those guys hung out in London, the more likely they'd be corrupted, by London. And so then the American colonists wouldn't trust them to represent their interests anyway, right? Like, it's just really difficult when it takes 4 to 6 weeks to cross the Atlantic Ocean to kind of, as Thomas Paine says, to govern a continent from an island, right? Like, it's just really difficult. I think what the Americans would have wanted is like what New England private colleges want, right? They want, like, what's it called? Like a voluntary payment in lieu of taxes, right? Like, that's what that's the model that the American colonists would have preferred, I think. Maybe they could have been talked into that if wiser heads had prevailed. But really what the Americans want, it's not even about taxation. Like Harvard and Yale, for instance, don't really pay their full share of taxes, right? What they give voluntary payments in lieu of taxes. Right. It unfortunately starves the public education systems of those states. But like a lot of private colleges, especially the ones that were affiliated with churches back in the day, have those arrangements, under long-standing agreements with those states, right? Like, we won't be taxed, right? We won't be forced to pay, but out of the goodness of our hearts, we will pay up to X amount, in order to continue to exist in the state. So that's the kind of model that the American colonists might have preferred. But really, taxes in truth probably weren't even really the issue. What the Americans wanted to be able to do was trade with whoever they wanted, right? They wanted to be able to trade with the French, the enemy, right? Go down to the French Caribbean islands and, get raw materials in exchange for American goods. And the British Empire are like, we're trying to run an empire here. You can't just trade wherever you want. And the American colonists are like, well, we're kind of fed up with that and maybe want to be our own country. And so these things are played out like where initially the Americans are like, well, we're fine with trade regulations, but we don't like taxes. And then the Americans say, well, we don't really like taxes either. And maybe we don't want Parliament to have any authority at all. And then maybe we don't even think that the king protects us anymore, and so we want to get rid of monarchy and aristocracy and all these other stuff. I mean, we're grateful to it in a sense because we prefer democracy to aristocracy and monarchy, and and the founding fathers had a lot of great statements about the rights of man that are eternal and inspirational all over the globe. I don't want to knock what the revolution achieved, but it's also pointless to deny that there weren't also some pretty selfish motives involved on behalf of the Americans at the time as well.
Ben, you mentioned that the Americans also imported tea from Denmark and Netherlands. Was there any differences in quality of that tea or cost of the tea, save the duties? Did they have a cost advantages over the British?
Sure, cost, sure, right? As far as the quality of the tea, not necessarily, right? I mean, the tea is all coming from the same 2 provinces in China, right? They would sort it all out, like, this is the fancy stuff, this is the middling stuff, this is the common stuff, Bohea, Singlo, Kongu, Hyson, right? Like they knew all of these varieties, and and there was a kind of schedule and an understanding, this is what it costs, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, because it takes 6 months or whatever, it's super expensive to get this tea from China to Europe and then to the American colonies or to the Caribbean to sell. but the British duties, because there were duties in England and duties in America that you would have to pay, right? Those taxes made British tea more expensive. And so smugglers did everything they could to undercut the British. Both, like half the tea that was drunk in England was smuggled, right? It's not just the American colonies who are participating in smuggling. So a lot of people went to those foreign European East India companies because, yeah, they could get the tea for cheaper. I'm sure I'm sure there was some kind of duty, but whatever it was, I guess it was, I'm sure there were ways that that those governments made profits from those enterprises, but whatever it was, you could get, why would you run the risk of smuggling unless you could make a bigger profit, right? So, yeah, so you could get that tea for cheaper.
Quick follow-up to that last question. What were the British government efforts to stop smuggling of British tea, of foreign tea within England itself? 50% was.
I didn't hear the last part of your question.
Yeah, sorry, if you said 50% of the tea in England was actually smuggled from foreign companies, that kind of underrides the idea of a British East India Company monopoly.
Right. Yeah, monopolies are hard. Trade wants to find its own routes, right? Buy low, sell high, right? That's the rule.
Exactly. So what was the kind of, were there any enforcement or kind of government actions to stop smuggling in England itself?
Oh, sure, they try, right? There were patrols on land, there were patrols at sea, but, but England has a lot of coves and inlets. The eastern seaboard of America has even more coves and inlets, right? There's no way that you can have complete enforcement on the high seas. It's really impossible. They try. If they catch you, they will seize your stuff and ruin you. They will levy fines. They will throw people in prison. They will, some of these patrols in England, I think, were armed, right? Like smuggling was a dangerous business. There was definitely some risk involved, but there was no way to make enforcement total. And in fact, I haven't read anything on this in a while, but it's possible that, England decided like, all right, as long as some of the tea is being sold through the East India Company, maybe we can afford to look the other way, right? I mean, British East India Company did have, in theory, other ways of making money, right? Textiles, from India. There were. The East India Company has a bit of a sordid history. There's lots that we could get into with that, but it's possible that they were like, if there's nothing we can do about it at some point, we're not going to throw good money after bad.
How many men was it estimated that actually boarded the ships and destroyed tea?
My opinion is 100, but there are people who talk about lower numbers, and the most unqualified lists of Tea Party participants say that there were as many as 200 people. But the thing is, I think there were different roles, right? Not everybody boarded the ships. Some of them were like on the wharves, kind of like acting as bouncers, being like, all right, that's not the whole, everybody on board, right? Like it's just these people doing this work. I mean, it was a very disciplined operation. I didn't get into this in the talk, but like they only touch the tea. They're not supposed to pocket it. Right? No other cargo is supposed to be touched. Apparently they broke a lock to one of the holds, and there's this famous story that they like replaced the lock, right? So like the idea is this isn't supposed to be unbridled mayhem or theft, right? They're just destroying this one commodity to which they have a constitutional objection, right? So it really was supposed to be a kind of a disciplined operation.
Thanks, Ben. This is really fascinating.
Thank you.
Chestertown, Maryland, celebrates every year dumping tea in the Chester River. They even built the brig Sultana, the replica of the ship, even though there's no record of there ever having been such an event in Chestertown. I was wondering, were there other local around the country, other examples of tea getting dumped, or was it worked out like it was in Charleston?
Yeah, no, I mean, they burned Lexington in the town green even before the Boston Tea Party, actually. There's a tea party at Greenwich in New Jersey. There's a book by Joseph Cummings where he talks about like a bunch of tea parties that happened up and down the coast. James Fichter in this new book is much more caustic and skeptical of these. What he says is that the Sons of Liberty always fluffed this stuff in the newspaper, but in fact, you would see news items about this, and then right next to that, you'd see an ad like tea for sale, so that in other words, Americans kept drinking it anyway. I mean, a lot of Americans, like, Benjamin Franklin's like, or John Adams will be like, I'm going to close my eyes and just assume this is smuggled tea. Don't tell me, but because there's no way to tell the difference essentially of whether, when you finally get the tea to the tea table, like whether it had come through the British Empire and was supposed to be objectionable, or whether it had been smuggled and there was therefore less objectionable. So they have this attempt to maintain the boycott of tea in 1774, but eventually by the start of the war, they essentially give up and tea is being sold all up and down. I mean, there are people who are like, that's why we drink coffee in America and not tea, right? Is because of the Boston Tea Party. But the reason for that is that, it's just cheaper to get coffee from Jamaica and Brazil in the 19th century. And so that's why we have a coffee habit instead of a tea habit, right? If it hadn't been for the British Empire, right? America does begin trading with China in the 1790s, but they were competing with the British. Tea was harder to get. The British start farming their own tea in India, and that's more expensive for Americans to get. So Americans continue to drink tea for a few generations. There are obviously still plenty of Americans who drink tea, but coffee becomes the easier beverage to get.
Hi, this is great.
Thank you.
So what percentage would you say of the people that participated would have been like under 18?
Yeah, I have that exact statistic in the book, and I can't remember. The majority of them I know were between the ages of 18 and 29, and then there was a significant. There's a really funny story I can tell about this, which is that even though this picture, right, shows these like kind of lush, gorgeous waves, right, that the tea is being dumped into. In actuality, the tide was out. And so they dump all this tea over the side of the ships, and it begins to clump above the waterline in this really kind of embarrassing way. And so they pick a bunch of teenage apprentice boys, and they say, you and you, go out in a little boat, whack at these piles with your oar until it dissolves, right? So that the tea will be effectively destroyed. Because otherwise you could just wade out into there and like grab a clump of tea for yourself and take it home. There actually were people who picked up tea in Dorchester that way. The only problem is, right, like there's a bit of a selection bias problem, right? Because these stories don't come out until the 1820s and 1830s. And so if you talk to somebody who's still alive at that point and says, I was in the Boston Tea Party, they were much more likely to have been a teenager or 20-something then, right? A guy who was in his 40s at the time of the Tea Party would have died maybe before anyone was talking about having participated in the Boston Tea Party. I mean, they keep it a secret for 50 years. Right. So it's quite possible that there were plenty of 40-somethings and above, as long as they were physically fit, they could have done this. But, I think that their stories would have been less likely to have gotten told. So it's I feel uncomfortable kind of saying exactly this percentage were this age, because I know that the data I'm dealing with, small enough as it is skewed. You see what I mean? It's just a tricky thing. We got to, all historians have to work with imperfect information.
There's a reason I ask. It's because, now I'm like questioning my ancestors involved, because he was 17 and he wrote up all.
Totally, there are plenty of stories of, I was a teenage boy, I participated in this. There are stories with details about teenagers having participated. And there are contemporary stories of the Boston Massacre of boys throwing rocks, boys throwing snowballs. There's a book on children in American history, and John Bell, who I was mentioning before, has a great little article on the boys of Boston and their participation in various crowd action. When John Adams is saying, who was it? It was boys, Teagues, by which he meant Irishmen, black people, right? Sailors, Jack Tars, right? That was who was in the crowd at the Boston Massacre. So there was a sort of understanding that boys were involved. In fact, a few weeks before the Boston Massacre, a customs importer named Ebenezer Richardson, there was a mob around his house. He fired a gun out the window and killed an 11-year-old German boy named Christopher Sider. So, actually, like the role of children in the American Revolution, and actually there's a late book by Caroline Cox, a book by the late Caroline Cox on boy soldiers in the American Revolution. There's a lot of interesting work about the participation of younger boys in the Revolutionary era. I often tell this to, K-12 teachers, right? That like, you can make these stories instantly appeal to children and teenagers, I think, by reminding them that people their age, were experiencing these events and in some cases actively participating in them.
You mentioned that people drank tea at that time with sugar. When did milk start getting to be used?
Oh, that's well, the creamers were definitely in use in the 18th century. So definitely milk and cream were being which is my image. Milk and cream were being used with tea definitely in the 1700s. I mean, like the history of tea in the 1600s is a little weird because it's very rare and it's kind of treated as almost like a special spice. Maybe it's medicinal, maybe it would work for this, maybe it would work for that, right? Like it's and then it only becomes this kind of like routine caffeinated beverage with you know, with these like where you have your sugar and your cream and a whole ritual surrounding it. It doesn't mature into that really until the 1700s in terms of the middle class population. As an upper class thing, you can see it still as early as the 1600s. So it's a long gradual process of you know, it becoming a kind of consumer good, and it's marketed and it's debated. I try and get into the kind of long history of tea in chapter 3 of my book.
All right. We do have some questions on Zoom.
Oh yeah,
if you
happy
wouldn't
to
mind
talk to
taking a
the
few more.
PJ crowd. Yeah.
There are a lot, so I'm only going to pick a handful because we'll be here till midnight, and we don't want that. But what was the official inquiry done by the Crown? What was that like? What were they just in utter shock when they first heard about this? What?
Yeah, they are outraged. Both in Boston and in London, they contemplate, hey, could we prosecute anybody for treason? And then they kind of are like, yeah, we're probably not going to be able to make treason charge stick. But they do think about pursuing lesser criminal charges. I forget what the charge would have been, but there is a debate. The problem is that as with the Gaspé affair in Providence, Rhode Island the previous year, there is no way to get reliable witnesses to testify against an American crowd, because that was a good way to get your head beaten in. So yeah, I mean, no one is ever prosecuted. The reason though, James Fenimore Cooper actually suggests that the reason why they keep it secret for another 50 years is that even though it was unlikely that anyone would criminally prosecute the Tea Party, the tea destroyers, it was possible that those men would have been liable to civil suit by the East India Company. So there's some suggestion that might have been the reason why it continued to stay a secret. You know, it's like with OJ, right? If you can't get somebody in a criminal trial, you file a civil suit.
Very good. And where can people buy either of your books, both your books?
Oh, wherever books are sold. Celebrate the Tea Party by buying from a monopoly company would be one way, but you can also buy my last 2 books, directly from Yale University Press. You can ask your local bookstore to order them if you want to support a local bookstore. There are other major online retailers that you can buy the books from. They are definitely both available in a variety of formats. The audiobook and paperback of my new book will be out in a couple of months. The audiobook was a little bit delayed, but the Tea Party book is available in Kindle, audiobook, ebook, audiobook, paperback, and I might be hard to get the hardcover except used.
Well, you might have a spike tonight. We have a lot, according to the chat. There's going to be some people going out and buying a copy. So,
well, I appreciate that, and that is my favorite question of the evening. So,
yeah, there you go. You might even like this one more, since you tackled the majority of the other ones as I'm going through here. One viewer, and we'll end on this. Do you know how good you really are?
No, I am too modest to know this.
You
so,
have.
I reject the premise of your question. Right?
You've blown everybody away, not just here, but on Zoom. And I appreciate you coming down here to speak for us tonight on 250th anniversary. And you're heading up to Boston this weekend, correct?
Yeah, I'll be around. I hope I'll make the reenactment, but I'm giving a couple of talks in Boston on the day, the 250 years to the day. I'll be able to get a sense of how early it gets dark and and all those things. My experience of Boston winter again. I taught at Tufts for 8 years, so I gave it the office as far as Boston winters, but I'm being dragged back there.
Very good, Ben. Thank you very much. Always a pleasure to have you here. We appreciate you coming back again. Thank you all for coming out tonight in person and on Zoom, and for your continued support of our mission. Get home safe, and we'll see you next time. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone.